Hi everyone, this is Jason Barrack of Wall Street from Main Street. Welcome back to another Wall Street from Main Street podcast interview. Today's special guest is a returning guest, but we've got basically someone who's a new whistleblower, and he's breaking some news, and he's been rabble-rousing. He has decades of experience on Wall Street, and he covers investment and economics, geopolitics, history, travel, and a lot of other things. Charles Ortel, thank you for joining me again.
Thanks for having me on, Jason. Appreciate it.
Now, Charles, you just set up your blog website, and you just released, I think, a 9-page document talking about the Clinton Foundation. I think you called it the largest charity fraud ever attempted. Why do you think that's the case?
Well, Jason, in the past 15 months or so, what I've been doing, because I'm generally interested in how charities operate and the task of trying to figure out from public disclosures what's a good charity and what's an ineffective charity, I looked at the Clinton Foundation and concluded back in March 2015 that it had some very serious financial irregularities and filing irregularities. And then I decided I really better not only look at the filings that they have made, but consider the laws that operate in the U.S. States and in federal level and then in foreign countries to try to figure out what filings have they failed to make that they should have made. And then that led me into a discussion or an analysis of what are the charities that are related to the Clinton Foundation that are run by trustees or others, other insiders of the Clinton Foundation whose results should have been included or at least mentioned in the Clinton Foundation filings. And when you do all that work, you discover that the $2 billion or so in declared donations to the Clinton Foundation are a small percentage of the total amounts that have been raised for charity in the name of the Clinton Foundation or by trustees or others associated with the Clinton Foundation. The total pool that I've been able to come up with so far is more in the order of $100 billion. And much of that money is missing.
That's just totally shocking. How much attention are you getting from the mainstream media about this analysis that you've done?
Well, it takes a while. In the beginning, nobody really wants to admit that something this big could have happened. If you think back to Madoff was roughly a $60 billion fraud, depending on how you count it, but order of magnitude $60 billion. Enron was, I think, less than $20 billion. So when you start talking about $100 billion and you start talking about major governments around the world having been defrauded and small contributors. In fact, the real damage here is that Bill Clinton and the team around him, Ira Magaziner and others, have gotten involved standing in front of aid flows that are sent by governments and also by the small donors around the world who will send money over the internet or using PayPal or other means, little bits, $5 here, $10 there. But when it comes from the many millions of people who look at the tsunami or look at Katrina or look at Haiti or look at earthquakes in India and say, let's help out, suddenly you get these massive flows that go towards an entity like the Clinton Foundation, but the rules are not robust enough, nor are the regulators knowledgeable enough to be able to track all this down and figure out, how much money went towards these efforts and then where did the money actually go? There's no global regulator of charities. So you have that one level fraud of the small bits and pieces going to the central pool, and then you have the other equally despicable fraud, which is the annual financial reports of a U.S. public charity, which is what the Clinton Foundation and most of its entities, that's the form that they have taken. Those entities with revenues in excess of $500,000 per year have to get a real audit, and I don't mean the kind of audit the IRS does if you screw up on your tax returns. I mean income statement, balance sheet, cash flow statement, footnotes, consistently prepared for the same bunch of entities on a multi-year period with lots of disclosures if there are irregularities. And the Clinton Foundation not only has not come close to doing that in any one year, they have never procured a valid, legally compliant audit for any period October 23rd, 1997, when it was legally organized in Arkansas, to the present, notwithstanding all of the concerns that were raised last year by me and by others that prompted them to refile on November 16th, 2015, returns for the period 2010 through 2013. So these people have been on notice publicly, and in the press and by others, that they really needed to get their act together. And instead of correcting their record, if that's possible, they continue to keep these forms out there in the public domain. And these are the only forms that an educated donor has when that donor decides, should I make a donation or not? Is this in compliance with the law or not? So I'll break a little bit of news on this podcast and say the trustees from inception to date are guilty of gross negligence and willful misconduct in not discharging their responsibilities to make sure that the valuable federal tax exemption and state and foreign tax exemptions of this charity have been protected by following the rules that are required. And they also have been guilty of solicitation fraud. It's a very serious offense when you have false and materially misleading documents in the public domain and you continue to raise money, as they are during this podcast, raising money. That's solicitation fraud. And there, it depends which state we're talking about federally and internationally, but when you do it using telephones, the internet, and mail, each request, not each massive solicitation, but each individual request to a potential donor can be, in certain jurisdictions, a felony crime. If you're talking,
so there's thousands of fraud cases then, right?
Try tens of millions.
Wow. Are you familiar with Roger Stone's work? He released a book recently on the Clintons' war on women, where he interviewed, people that Bill Clinton allegedly, raped or sexually harassed, and Hillary covered it up. He has a best-selling book out about that. He's also been telling stories about charity fraud that he heard from his sources, in D.C. He's worked in politics for a very long time. He said that you talked about on your website about Haiti specifically, but one of his stories is that the Bush family and the Clinton family worked together to supposedly, raise money. I think there was a big earthquake in Haiti a few years ago. They raised over $100 million supposedly for this charity to give to the needy people in Haiti, and then only maybe 10 million of the money actually went to the needy people, and they just split the rest of the money that was raised between the Bush and the Clintons and pocketed it for themselves.
Well, it's a lot worse than that, actually. So if you're talking specifically about Haiti, the real story on Haiti is that the Clinton Foundation began operating in Haiti in 2003 illegally. They were not authorized at that time to be anything other than, by the IRS, to be anything other than a library and research facility in Little Rock, Arkansas. They had no staff competent, under their control to operate any international activities, let alone fighting HIV/AIDS, if that's what they were actually doing in Haiti by 2003. They continued to operate illegally in many countries, pursuing purposes that were not validly authorized by the IRS. And ultimately, by 2009, Bill Clinton was appointed special UN envoy to Haiti. Then in 2010, in January, there was an earthquake, and on the 12th of January. And around that time, efforts began to not only have monies raised by the Clinton Foundation, principally in New York, by personnel based in New York, but in theory to jointly raise money with the George W. Bush presidential facility. But that's small beer. The $100 million you're talking about there, and again, I would remind you and your listeners that no one really knows how much money was raised because none of these entities has ever been audited. None of the stuff's verified. But there is an additional $14 billion, it is estimated, that was raised under the care and control of Bill Clinton and a former leader of Haiti. That to this date. And Bill and this other person had the responsibility for administering this estimated $14 billion. There's never been an accounting for this money. There are regularly riots and protests in Haiti over this issue. And the people of Haiti have been crying out, so much so that when some people saw work that I'd done a number of months ago, I've been approached by numerous people in Haiti. I've done a series of interviews with a wonderful woman who's born in Haiti, is now a professor of biology in Texas, named, I'll spell the name out, D-A-D-Y and then C-H-E-R-Y. And she's done 2 interviews that you can find at me. Just Google my name and her name. where we go in some depth into what really happened in Haiti. And here, it's one thing to set up a charity and make a mistake, technical violation, that these things will happen. But it's yet another thing to serially go around the world almost like a predator on the heels of a natural disaster, stand up in front of the world and say, you can trust me to take care of these massive sums that are going to go to these desperately poor people. And then in Gujarat, India, in January 2001, you begin the process of, standing in front of a massive aid flow, estimated at $1 billion. But then it seems that less than $1 million actually may have gone towards the victims. In the tsunami in early 2005, again, the estimates are like $13 billion was sent towards the Clinton Foundation, and no one really knows, where this money actually ended up. Then you have the HIV/AIDS stuff, which is a multi-year process. Ultimately, an entity called the Global Fund raised in the many tens of billions. It's unclear exactly how much money, and once again, estimates run to say half to two-thirds of that money disappeared. When you start doing this in country after country, whether it's India, Central America, South America, Asia, Africa, time after time and again, it's not a technical series of glitches. And unfortunately, the world is a difficult place. There are going to be a lot of natural disasters. Nothing any politician can do will really stop them from happening, be they earthquakes or forest fires or floods or whatever. And the world really needs a tougher regulatory regime to make sure that, in particular, former presidents and former world leaders don't get involved in these type of activities and fail to exercise the tight controls that need to be exercised to make sure that money isn't scammed and diverted that should go to people who are really hurting, dying, wounded, emotionally and otherwise.
Now, Charles, I don't know if you've been following the Clinton email scandal pretty closely, but Hillary's basically pretty Teflon coated. She's avoided, any type of charges. She's so far managed to look like she set herself up to win the nomination for the Democratic Party as of right now. And there's also been many billionaires worldwide donating to this corrupt Clinton Foundation. Do you think that plays a part in why no charges have come yet from this? Is that, there's so many billionaires involved in donating money, and the fact that, she's so politically connected, she knows where the bodies are buried, she has dirt on everyone. Do you think that's a big part of it? Why?
Well, looking at the whole Peter Schweitzer book that you're referring to, I think Clinton Cash, I've met Peter Schweitzer. I went to the opening of his movie. I think it's a pretty good, excellent work. I think to look at the Clintons, and remember an investor and a financial type. I'm interested in charity. I'm familiar with how good ones operate, ones that do tightly control their international operations. But I'm not really involved in partisan politics. I do know the Clinton record. I know a lot of facts about them. I find their record reprehensible as far as personal conduct is concerned, and I'm not just referring to Bill. But all that said, what I think is when you look at the Clinton career, going all the way back to the starting days in Arkansas when Bill was Attorney General, you could say what you want about their policies, but I think the polite way to put it is that the Clinton family are definitely bankable. That is to say, if you make a contribution towards them, you can be pretty certain that your interests will be looked at reasonably well. Alternatively, perhaps it can also be stated that if you make a significant contribution to them, that you might say get pardoned, as Mark Rich was pardoned. So there are many reasons people with money might have to curry favor with the Clintons, especially if they believe the Clintons are going to win. So who knows the real motives of a lot of these people? Who knows what they really actually put up around the world, the various Peter Schweitzer stories and other stories. Of course, you're not going to find a hard trail of evidence if somebody gave money towards the Clinton Foundation that then was directed towards one of these world leaders, particularly in the poorer, resource-rich places of the world who might grant concessions, be they for mining or forestry or telecom. You're not going to find a hard audit trail there. But, the flip side of it is that as far as a charity is concerned, the rules and regulations that operate and should be used and should be followed when you run a charity are very, very strict. So there you must actually retain very good records in the charity and the donors themselves, if they want to actually justify the tax exemption that they get or tax deduction that they get for making donations to a charity. So there's a rich email trail. And the theory that Hillary used originally was, there were roughly 55,000 emails, and we don't know if that's a true number. That's just the number that was mooted. And then a number of those were supposedly deleted because they were, in quotes, personal. We don't know if that's really true because we don't know who actually made that judgment and what is the difference between a personal email and a State Department email and a foundation email, and what about emails that are a mixture of the two or even the three. So we don't really know yet the whole record, but what I am hearing through the grapevine and through people who know quite a bit, who are expert in the area of cybersecurity and email traffic, as somebody likes to joke, the E in email stands for evidence. It doesn't go away. The fact that you delete an email off a server or off a device does not mean that you've actually deleted the email. It could well be that these emails are on remote servers. It could well be that emails were hacked. It could well be by governments and other hackers. It could well be that people involved in these transactions maintain copies, either for insurance copies or otherwise. So I don't sign on to the theory that the emails are missing. And I do think it is very dangerous to do what the Clintons did, what Cheryl Mills and Hillary did, and Uma Abedin saying, we've turned over, quote, all of our emails, and then have some of them resurface. But going to one thing that I would say is really a canard is this issue of, even going down the rabbit hole, did we get all the email back? Thieves, when they steal things, and get caught, they give them back, and they try to argue, well, look, I gave it back, so there's no real harm done. The information in these emails is the property of the U.S. government, we the people. At no time did Hillary Clinton and her team have the actual legal right to walk off with our property, keep it outside secure control, possibly in Chappaqua, possibly in Washington, D.C., who knows where. Keep it after she left her role as Secretary of State, and then only give back a portion of what she took in their sole judgment. I mean, that's just not even remote. It would be as if they walked out with Air Force One, flew around the world on it, and then gave it back 2 years later and said, well, we gave it back. It's not really theft. It's a theft. And, the data that some of the data that's admitted or it's been found on these emails was at the highest possible security clearance, so high that you can't actually spear it off, the hardcore computer, which it resided inside what are called SCIFs, secure compartmentalized information facilities. How did that information even make it off those SCIFs into these emails that became the property temporarily of the Clintons and were returned to us? So I think this is a very serious set of problems that they have. On the email side, I think you're not just simply talking about appropriation of property. You could be talking about treason. You could be talking about having highly confidential reports and information in these houses that may have been visited by people who shouldn't have ever seen this information. And by the way, I don't think Hillary Clinton herself was sorting through these emails. Uma Abedin was supposed to be her closest associate, confidant. Who vetted Uma Abedin? Where's the record of what she was asked? Who went into her background? So there are a lot of very serious questions here.
Yeah, Charles, I think there's actually emails that have been released. I think Zero Hedge or Julian Assange had them, copies of the emails saying where Hillary Clinton actually asked one of her aides, like her top aide, to actually unmark top secret emails, unmark them from top secret to regular. So, I mean, that's even sketchy there. So, but what I know from my contacts, I know some women who are lawyers and work in the Department of Justice, and they love Hillary Clinton. So she has a lot of protectors and fans in those government agencies, probably delaying things and fighting for her. And I've even seen stories that now the Obama administration is trying to stop, her getting charged, because then it would make them look bad too, and potentially, hurt the Democratic ticket, this close to the election. So it'll be interesting to see how things play out. Now, I've read some articles in the mainstream media, too, talking about, the Clinton Foundation. They've called it a slush fund or a super PAC that occasionally makes a charitable donation. Would you agree with that, or do you think, their fraud goes a lot deeper than those things?
Well, it's worth spending a few minutes just on what a public charity is and is not. So the laws that regulate public charities in the United States, like the Clinton Foundation, are grounded in ancient English tradition that dates to 1601 in a statute that was codified in England then, that at that point in time settled the question under English law of what is a charity. Because you and I get together and let's say we like to go to Europe and look at Norman castles. Setting up a charity to go help people preserve Norman castles may or may not be charitable, depending on who's doing the work and what are you actually supporting and how tightly are you controlling this international activity. Are you disclosing your conflicts of interest? There are all sorts of very strict rules here. So what you do is you start out with the Clinton Foundation and you have to pick a legal state to be your headquarters state. So they picked Arkansas, thinking perhaps that they could control matters there. Then in Arkansas, it's typical when you set up a nonprofit corporation, doesn't mean it's tax exempt yet. It just means that you're not seeking a profit. What will happen when you set up a corporate charter for a nonprofit is it may have an expansive set of purposes articulated in the charter. That's not good enough. You will not get a federal tax exemption if you say, I'm going to do good works, whatever comes to mind, it may change my purpose. No, you have to set a specific group of purposes out. They have to be purposes that can be accomplished. You have to have a team involved with it that is competent, that has the qualifications required to accomplish the purpose. And over time, you have to accomplish the purpose. Foundations are not meant to go into perpetuity fighting against windmills. You've got to pick something and get it done. So the purpose they picked was to set up this library and archive in Little Rock, Arkansas, and to create an endowment for it. Those were the purposes. All right, so you put that application together for federal tax exemption with the IRS. And the way the IRS tends to work on this normally is they say, well, it's in the interest of the United States to have as many charities as possible. So we will give this a rather, we'll check it, but we want this to get approved if possible. And what they do, the leverage they hold over you, is that if you make an incomplete, false, or materially misleading application, they're all in writing with exhibits attached under penalties of perjury. If you a lie on your application and the IRS later discovers that, they can go back and retroactively revoke your charter, which is a very big problem. When you retroactively revoke the charter of a federally tax-exempt nonprofit, what happens is that entity has to pay corporate income taxes if there's a difference between the revenues and the expenses. And all the donations that were made where people took tax deductions in the U.S., those tax benefits need to be repaid with penalties and interest. So that's a huge problem for the trustees who would then get sued and be liable civilly. Now, the next step in the chain, though, is if you have a federal tax exemption, doesn't mean that you can solicit donors in every state in the union. Each state has a different set of rules. 46, from memory, have very strict rules, and 47, counting D.C., where you have to, before you solicit, lay out the qualifications of your trustees and of your organization. You have to also notify the public of any defects of the trustees in your organization, and then you get approved to solicit. Once you're approved to solicit, you then have to fill out an annual report in each state. Now, if you are soliciting while these reports are false and material and misleading, you are committing solicitation fraud. And penalties for that depend state, D.C., by state. So there's and that's just in the U.S. If you want to operate internationally, you cannot set up an international charity without first setting up the headquarters in the United States under U.S. law. So you set something up in the U.S., and then you must tightly control its international activities. And by that I mean you have to have board meetings, you have to be legally operated in every jurisdiction. So if you, let's say, operating in Tanzania, Tanzania law says you've got to have register here and register there, and you've got to have this kind of board and this kind of, you've got to do all that work. And you have to have real meetings and records. And if you don't do that, the IRS takes a hard look at you. The trustees, the executives, the significant donors, anybody who's in a position to exercise significant influence is in very serious trouble. Now, why might Bill Clinton and the Clinton family have gotten away with this from January 2001 to the present? The person who was in charge of initially overseeing the department that looks at tough applications was a person whose name you know, Lois Lerner. And then from January 2006 until she left in disgrace, she was in charge of this entire department of the IRS. So the Clintons may have felt they had an ally in Lois Lerner, and the IRS would never go after them. They may have felt they had allies back in Arkansas. Now, going back, I didn't fully answer the question about the Bushes and the Clintons. When you go into the long history of the Clintons, go all the way back, you will see that the Clintons and the Bushes have been involved in a series of activities together, starting with, you can start as late as tsunami, and look at Katrina, and look at Gulf Coast recovery, and look at the Haiti Fund. And there are defects in each of those operations, material defects. So it is possible that the Clintons felt, that they were in a position where, their charity had problems, but a Bush-related charity had problems. So the political resolution of this might be, charities make mistakes. We were trying to do this for all good reasons. Just give us a pass. Let us move along. There's nothing to see here. That may be what they felt was the case politically. But I take a very different view about this. The people who give the most to charity in this country, who are really giving to charity, are not giving money to the charity to get a political benefit. Those people are actually, in number, the poor. And in terms of their contribution relative to their income, they give far more generously to charities than the rich do. And there are many reports, indeed in a book that Bill wrote called Giving in September 2007, he recounts vignettes, school children and young people and old retirees who decide, this Clinton Foundation, they've heard so much about it, they're going to give it a lot of money. And it's for those people, the general public who, believe that charities are not supposed to be alternative vehicles to fund partisan political activity. A public charity is expressly barred from raising money for a charity that then gets diverted into political campaigns. That's a serious offense. And now it can happen on the other parties too. I mean, I'm not saying it's only a Democrat thing, but in this Clinton Foundation case, from the very beginning on October 23rd, 1997, when you look at the timeline forward, it sure looks to me as if the main operation is little more than a front to advance the political and personal financial interests of the Clinton family.
Yeah, I think my research indicates that Bill and Hillary Clinton have been committing potential felonies for many decades, and not just the Clinton Foundation, not just their war on women, silencing potential women coming forward. I mean, there's other instances that we can mention on this podcast that I won't right now. I want to transition and ask you about past whistleblowers like Harry Markopoulos. We have a lady now out who just wrote a book about. It's called J.P. Madoff. The mainstream media gave her 2 minutes on the air, and then they silenced her. And she basically talks about in the book, she's a lawyer working with the Madoff trustees, I guess, trying to get them more money, how J.P. Morgan knew that the Bernie Madoff was running a Ponzi for many, many years because the money that was coming into the account and it wasn't being used to buy the securities, et cetera, et cetera. And then Harry Markopoulos brought, mountains of evidence to the SEC, and for over a decade they knew that basically, there was mountains of evidence proving Madoff. Are you worried then that, you're going to bring all this, you have some evidence brought forward, you're going to bring more and more evidence, and it's just going to get sat on for a decade or more and very little is going to get done?
Well, no, I'm not, because here's some important differences. In the case of Madoff, it was an international securities fraud, but the international folks relied on the U.S. government, and particularly the SEC, to take the lead, the FBI eventually, in getting to the bottom of what happened. What's really interesting with charity fraud, and for those who are thinking about becoming trustees, listen carefully, the rules about charity fraud are incredibly strict in Trustees can't hide behind the executives and accountants or whatever. Trustees are ultimately responsible. And it's very difficult to get any kind of insurance to protect you in the case of fraud involving a charity. So when I looked at this, I realized back in March 2015 that it was a very serious matter. I wrote an article that got a lot of attention. I think the title was "With So Many Red Flags, Why Isn't the IRS Auditing the Clinton Foundation?" After a short while, I realized that the vulnerability for the Clintons here is that while President Obama could conceivably pardon the trustees and the Clinton family in particular for federal offenses, the President of the United States cannot pardon state offenses and certainly cannot pardon foreign offenses. So this charity that has been operating and illegally soliciting money around the world, taking money from the small and also from many governors and governments and many large celebrity philanthropies like the Gates Foundation and Elton John and the Children's Investment Fund Foundation and others, this entity and the trustees have mammoth potential liabilities in multiple legal jurisdictions that are out of the control of the president and the U.S. political process. So my hope here is that as more people begin to study the severity of this, the fact that it is something that started in '97 and then got bigger and bigger and escalated, got more and more brazen, I'm hopeful that multiple government authorities and other regulators and investigative journalists with whom I am now working around the world will be able to make this story widely known. And I am beginning to have some progress getting this story into the mainstream media.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you've been paying attention to how the Obama administration has been treating whistleblowers, but they haven't done a good job with Edward Snowden and many other whistleblowers, treating them with respect for having the courage to come forward. So I applaud you for having the courage to put your name on all these research reports, because you could have submitted them, I guess, anonymously in detail if you wanted to protect yourself, but you have the courage to come forward and put your name on it. So hopefully there's no blowback or anything from any government regulators that are in the pocket of politicians.
Well, thank you for saying that. But this is different than you look at the Madoff case, and you look. I'm sure we've all invested in funds. Nobody ever comes to you with a fund that's going to be so great that it'll lose your money. It's always a great story about this and that. And at the heart of the Madoff saga, obviously there were a crooked family and a crooked bunch of operators, but there were a lot of gullible, greedy investors who. Many of them were much smarter. They should have known better than to give all of their money to one fund, first of all. And secondly, they should have seen right through the idea that you can have consistent, above-average, regular rates of return, and that when you look for the audit of those rates of return, they come to you from some schlock accounting firm on the second floor of a strip mall in upstate New York. I mean, there were some obvious signs here, and on that point, there's a similarity between the Madoff financial disclosures and the Clinton Foundation, and that is that the Clinton Foundation, in quotes, audits are not audits. They're not compliant with generally accepted accounting standards. They're not consistent. They don't make any sense. There are numerous material errors that anybody who finds them, you're not going to find the early ones on the Clinton Foundation website because they've purposely been kept off the Clinton Foundation website, because these audits say, I can't do the exact text from memory, but something like these financial statements have not been prepared in accordance with accounting requirements inside the United States of America. In other words, they're not compliant. Well, you can't do that. You can't keep statements outstanding covering the period October 23rd, 1997 through December 31st, 2004 that are not compliant with U.S. GAAP. Just full stop can't do it. So their solution was let's take those audits or those statements that purport to be audits off our main website so nobody will find them. Well, I and others found them in these states. The U.S. states force you to file these financial requirements, and they filed them in multiple U.S. states. Fortunately, online services will let you retrieve them. So, like Madoff, the Clinton Foundation has financial statements which on their face and they're not just technically wrong, they're laughable.
Yeah, Charles, another whistleblower that's not getting fair treatment, in my opinion, is Edward Snowden. I mean, he got ran out of the country. There's a lot of politicians after him still. I think his bank accounts are frozen, all for, trying to want to reform the government and wanting the government to conform to strict laws. So, hopefully no one tries anything like that on you. But I want to switch gears and ask you now about the global economy and the stock market. When I see the data, news stories coming out about the global economy, things just seem to be worse and worse. Why do you think the stock market hasn't crashed yet?
I think there's a very simple reason, and we may have discussed this in the past. I mean, if you think about nations, we are the least dirty shirt in the international laundry. In other words, U.S. securities, while stretched for various reasons, are certainly not as bad as Brazilian securities or Russian securities or Chinese securities or India, whatever. So there's a lot more wealth, financial and other wealth around the world than there are securities which would satisfy you and me and others who look at fundamentals as being intrinsically valuable. That's step one. Step two, I mean, the estimates of financial wealth run to the order of $250 trillion or so, and the value and the total world GDP is something like 70 trillion or so. And the individual amount of total amount of securities that you could buy in the U.S. is small. So there's a lot more demand for securities of any type than there is supply for securities that you might like, and that creates artificial upward pressure on the prices of U.S. securities in particular. That's one thing. The second thing is that the central banks, which have, I would argue, have almost criminally suppressed interest rates in the major markets around the world, in some cases turning them into negative, has led people to take leave of their senses when they value securities. I mean, the fact that the benchmark yield, let's say in Germany for a 10-year paper is going to be, I don't know what it is precisely, but let's say it's negative 70 basis points, or whatever the number is, that you can then buy GE common stock yielding 3%, leads people to make stupid investment decisions. You say, well, I'm going to be punished if I buy risk-free. I may as well, buy into a multinational, which, after all, once the global economy comes back, surely its share price should go back from 30, where it is now, to close to its multi-year high, which was 60. So rather than getting punished with negative interest rates, where I pay somebody for the privilege of letting them have my money, I get 3%. You make stupid decisions. You take leave of your senses. Another reason people have been doing that, and I pick on GE because it's a company I know reasonably well. A lot of people who own these big cap stocks, the old line companies, have a very low basis. So the way they look at these holdings is they say, I could sell them, but if I sell them, I'm going to have a huge tax bill, and then what do I do with the proceeds? So there's some very bad decisions being made, and people eventually are going to learn some tough lessons.
Yeah, I think eventually there is going to be a stock market crash, and then you're going to have the Wall Street banks. You're going to have the large players on Wall Street begging again for another quantitative easing program or bailout, because it seems that Wall Street, the people that are managing money there, they don't want the asset prices to be allowed to fall for a long period of time before they go throw a temper tantrum to the central bankers.
Well, and you see, the other thing that's going to happen here, and I've actually, I think I wrote a piece on this, and then I think also in a 10-point plan that's on my site, www.charlesortel.com, I discussed the idea that, in a grand bargain, where in the United States we might make some really tough choices, outlaw public sector unions, for example, and do a bunch of different things. As part to make everything work, I could see myself, depending on the elements of the grand bargain, actively supporting a temporary wealth tax. I mean, if you gave me a regime where we're going to have sound money backed by something real, I think it's more than fair to have some sort of a wealth tax used to make it possible to, let's say, shore up the capital of the Federal Reserve System and do the kinds of things that are required to make the United States have the strongest, most reliable currency in the world, restore the sense that investors around the world might have that our laws will actually protect private property as opposed to, benefiting the cronies of the political party that happens to be in power. In such an event, a wealth tax could make sense, but not, as Nancy Pelosi and others would like to have, just to make sure that the politicians can continue to fly around in their gigantic planes and stay in fancy hotel suites and continue business as usual, not solving problems which can, in fact, be solved.
The politicians, Charles, to me, who want the wealth tax, Bernie Sanders, Nancy Pelosi, a lot of them, number one, are dodging taxes with their own money and salaries. So they're moving money offshore. They're hypocrites. And then they want to just redistribute wealth so they can keep spending more and more money and keep, buying votes that way, giving it to the groups then that'll give them the most votes so they can, either stay in office or get a cushy lobbying job when they leave or something like that.
Could well be, but you see, I think the commonality of interest that we have here in this country. It's interesting. I'm noticing in the last 6 months or so that because of what I write, because of what I'm doing in the Clinton Foundation and other things, that I have a surprising coalition of support. It comes from people who are economically conservative and socially open-minded, and these tend to be people on the hard right as well as the hard left. Not so much in the mushy middle. But I think, what you see in the primary season so far is a rejection of the establishment and a hope that the public will get behind a team that will actually do what each of us has to do in our personal lives. I mean, it's that we can't go, if we have families and whatever, we can't come back home, with things out of control and then explain to our family, well, look, I was fighting really hard for you the last 30 years. I don't have anything solved, but I've been fighting for you. Let me keep fighting for you. I mean, we don't want to hear about the fights. I think the Americans across the political spectrum and good-hearted people around the world understand that the private sector has been disrupted, and the public sector is not. It's been entrenched. In the private sector, people are being replaced by machinery one way or another, by technology, by robots, by engineering. We're being replaced. And as people get more expensive, the process accelerates. In the public sector, not so much. Public sector, they just pile on these massive debts, so long as we can borrow, and, slow walk the debate to stay in process as long as possible. So we're I think, past an inflection point here. This election will mean a lot. It may mean, that we embrace socialism, which I'm not sure is the smartest thing in the world to do, given what we see in Venezuela and other places. But it may mean we go that way. It may mean we go towards a Trumpian revolution. But I don't think, we have years left of middle of the road mush.
Yeah, the global economy with low commodity prices, a lot of these commodity producing countries are in shambles right now. With the strong dollar and low commodity prices, they were in major trouble. So I think the global economy is in major trouble. The U.S. economy is not, decoupled. The U.S. economy is not decoupled from the global economy. So the last couple of years, the narrative from the mainstream media has been the U.S. economy is recovering. Obama's been repeating this. But if the rest of the world economy is not doing well, how can the U.S. continually keep doing well? It really can't, because of how connected the global economy is. So I think that's why we're starting to see a rally in gold recently, because it's a vote of no confidence in these central bankers. People are starting to believe, even Wall Street people who don't like gold, they're looking around at the valuations, like you said, at a lot of these stocks and saying, you know what, the stock market has already gone up a lot since 2009. I don't want to keep owning a lot of shares. And they don't trust the central banks and what the narrative is about the global economy doing well.
I think you're right. I mean, a lot of people I speak to, now I got out of business school in 1980, so I'm ancient. But a lot of the people that you speak to today, who, let's say, even have 10 years experience in the markets, don't have the kind of training that I think you need to look into financial statements and really appreciate how strong and how weak a company may be off of its publicly available information. When you look at, the so-called Dow 30, and you look, forget about the upside and, the non-GAAP analysis and all that. Just look at a very simple set of numbers. Look at the total debt on any one of those companies, and then look at the book value of the common equity, the junior most slice of the tranche of securities, and then subtract from that the equity any goodwill, any intangibles. The ratio of total debt to tangible net worth, like hard liquidation, in theory, liquidation value of these companies, is very, very high. And, it used to be in 1980, 1960, 1970, that there was some assemblage value, that it was tough to assemble a company, a workforce, and a market position. And once you did that, you had a moat. Warren Buffett likes to talk about a defensible moat. But, look at IBM and then look at the tech world today. IBM sat on top of the tech world for decades. And now it's a shadow compared, it's in trouble compared to all these upstarts that many of them didn't exist 15 years ago and have tremendously strong balance sheets today. Not just, growing revenues, growing cash flows, growing profits. You look at a Google or a Facebook or, Amazon, not Amazon, but some of them have very high amounts of cash, Apple, little debt, and basically not that much in the way of intangible assets, which is surprising for startups, high-tech players, and they built up very big net worth statements. So it's a strange world we're in, that these established companies have been disrupted. The private sector globally has been disrupted. The one part of the world that hasn't been yet disrupted, but instead is entrenched, is the least productive part of the global economy, and that's government.
Yep, and then we have governments, it seems, wanting to implement financial repression in China, Japan, Europe, the United States. They're even talking about negative interest rates here in the United States. So I think that's only going to scare more people because they're not going to be getting any interest keeping money in a checking account or savings account. In fact, they may have to pay money to keep it there. That's going to make the ability to hold gold, it's going to incentivize people to want to hold gold more outside of a bank account then, because, they're not going to be getting interest, and instead of paying a penalty tax to keep cash there.
Well, another thing I like to half joke about is that with gold, you don't have to go on an analyst conference call 4 times a year. You don't have to read through a 10K, an annual report, or proxy statement. All you got to make sure is that the gold is in a safe place, that it's sold to you by a reputable dealer, and that you can sell it ultimately. But you don't have to you don't have to listen to Jeff Immelt talk forever about the current incarnation of GE and why this year's version is going to win, when the one articulated since 2001 has failed every single time, every single restructuring. You don't have to do that. You don't even have to think about the direction of bond prices. Now, this is not for money that you may need next week for a car, or 2 years from now for college or whatever. This is for endowment capital, money that you're never going to use yourself, that you're just protecting and building for the long run. But I think gold and other scarce, not necessarily one-of-a-kind items, but scarce assets that will have value in almost any incarnation, after the stress of whatever coming crash, once the system re-regulates itself, scarce assets like gold and other things will always hold some value. On the other hand, people thought multiple large companies were very, very safe, and then you can discover in the blink of an eye, like an AIG or others, General Motors that went bankrupt. You look at General Motors, find their 1950 or 51 or 52 annual report, and you won't believe how strong that company was back then. 90% global market share, tremendous amounts of cash, little debt, and then in the blink of an eye, not too long later, 5 decades later or so, companies in extremis, and then 2008, sayonara.
Yeah, Charles, and I think the big 3 auto companies in the U.S. are going to need another bailout again. I've been hearing there's 3 levels of subprime auto loan debt, and that they're chopping this up into collateralized debt obligations like they did with subprime mortgage-backed securities, and they're doing that and selling, these subprime auto loan securities now that are chopped up to like pension funds all over the globe and stuff like that. So it looks like there's probably going to be bailouts again the next 5 years for the big auto companies, because a lot of their revenues are just, cars they're giving away for no money down, no interest rates for 5 years or something like that.
I know, it's shocking. People just don't learn. And of course, the last crash that occurred in the 2007 through 9 period, at least in the, I should say, 7 through December 31, 2008 period, interest rates were relatively high. So the central banks had firepower available to them in suppressing the rates. You can't really send rates much lower than they currently are for much longer. So this next crash, I've said in the past, I'll remind people that on December 31st, 2008, the global economy entered purgatory. Not speaking from a religious sense, just from the definition. We were neither in heaven nor in hell. We've still been in purgatory, and I'm afraid because our central bankers and the crony capitalists around the world haven't learned that the only way through a situation where there's too much capacity and not enough demand is to take capacity out of the system. That's what we have to do globally. And particularly as we're mechanizing workforces, there's so much in the way of surplus properties around, surplus factories, now surplus retail, gigantic retail complexes, soon office complexes. We've got to go through a period where supply and demand are brought closer into balance, and in particular in the richer countries in the world, where it is so much more sensible to replace workers. We've got to go through some pain before we can get out the other end. And politicians have delayed the inevitable too long. We're all going to pay a price for it. But let's be the country that figures this out and gets out first. Let's not wait to be the 40th country that figures out the right way to do it. We don't want to follow Japan.
Yeah, what I would like to... Yeah, I hope we don't follow Japan, although Japan doesn't allow immigration like the U.S. does, and Japan has a worse demographic problem than the U.S. right now. But I would like to see, I don't know if this will happen, Charles, I would like to see huge tax cuts in the U.S. for entrepreneurship and small business, making it easier for the small businessman out there to, grow his business, hire full-time employees, invest in his business, et cetera, and, a renewal of entrepreneurship. Maybe that'll happen now with crowdfunding, because I think they're going to allow retail investors soon to start crowdfunding entrepreneurs. I think Congress just approved it, so maybe I'll start it. I think, obviously boots on the ground, small business and entrepreneurs would help solve the problem. But globally, there's a debt problem, and what these central banks and governments are trying to do is they're trying to solve this global debt problem by piling on even more debt and creating more credit bubbles and asset bubbles and things like that. And you can't solve a debt problem with more debt.
I agree. Now, lest your audience feel that all I do is criticize, many months ago, I put up on my website a 10-point detailed plan on how to fix the problems that America has. And it's reasonably lengthy. You can actually reach me through my website if you have questions or suggestions. I'd love to get them. But I think there's a way through it, but it's not business as usual crony capitalism.
Amen, Charles. Amen. Yeah, the people on Main Street will hopefully solve this if they're allowed to. Like I said, a lot of the small business people that listen to this podcast, they tell us they want to hire more people, but there's so many rules and regulations and taxes that it's not in their interest to do so right now. Obviously they'll hire part-time people, but the way the laws are structured and stuff, hiring full-time, the taxes and regulations is just not there for most businesses, except for maybe technology businesses, because technology businesses are kind of ridiculous. Some of them, I guess the normal rules of business don't apply to a lot of technology businesses, unfortunately.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Jason.
Yeah, thank you again for your time, Charles, and I wish you the best of luck with what you're doing with the Clinton Foundation. You're a very brave guy. These Clintons, they're kind of dangerous. They're very foxy and clever with evading things. They've been doing it for a very, very long time.
Well, thanks again. And another way your listeners can reach out to me if they want is I'm on Twitter. It's @CharlesOrtel, uppercase C, uppercase O.